trade partnership, and then I'm going to talk to you about how it is only for companies, how the only gain is a marginal financial gain. It creates such big financial worries actually in the long run, and a whole lot of problems that also Lauri will talk about. So what is TTIP? So basically, two huge economical groups have decided that they want to get more money. This is basically what it is. It's not that the people of these economies want this money, but it's basically the corporations that want this money. So they want to cut the trade barriers between the US and the EU economies, and to get this 1-2% GDP growth out of it. And to be honest, like we can see that, yeah, probably you will have this short-term growth. It's marginal, and we don't care about it, most importantly, because there are bigger issues here. So how has it happened so far? So far they've drafted it, and to do it, you need to consult with people. So who have they consulted with? So they have consulted with 500 corporative lobbyists in order to do it, and also they've included a measly 4%, that's approximately 25 public interest groups, people into these discussions, which clearly already shows to you what it actually aims to do, which is to get money to the rich bastards that have lots of it already. So we see that, yeah.
Who are exactly these rich bastards you're talking about? Are we talking about corporations? Are we talking about the European governments? Are we talking about the rich people in each one of these countries? Who are these rich
Talking
bastards?
about politicians, talking about companies. Okay, let's go on. So, so what does it include then? It includes basically lowering the restrictions on basically banking, medicine, food, NHS, the environment, etc., and these kind of things. And now I'm going to move on to the crucial parts. This is the first part of what kind of financial worries do we get out of this system. So, as I told you, it's a quick way to get money. Of course, politicians love it because also they profit from it in the political capital sphere. They will get some money out of it to throw at the people to implement some kind of policies, whatever out of it, etc. But the problem here is that this 2% growth that at maximum that they can achieve with it, it's actually really short term. Now, why is it short term? Because if you look at the EU and the US economies, they're actually built really, really differently. They're not the same. So in order to do and implement this plan, they actually need to restructure things and lessen many restrictions. One of the restrictions, one of the most important restrictions that they're going to lessen are the banking restrictions in this case. You know, the banking restrictions that they actually implemented after the crisis of 2008 in the US banks. Well, these kinds of things are the ones that they want to now bring down to basically similar levels as they were pre-crisis. And why is this now so bad? Because, well, to simply say, that means that the big banking companies who wanted profit then kind of want profit now also, and are highly likely to do similar things. That means that, you know, create a new bubble, and basically at one moment that bubble is going to burst, and what happens then is a lot worse than it was in 2008. Now, why is it like that? Simple reason, because now we don't have two economies. We're talking about one major tangled economy, and the big problem with that is that. The big problem with that is that actually both of the markets now lose a lot. Half of the world's economy is basically crashing at that point, and we see that this is such a big potential harm that this 2% GDP growth that they're trying to achieve with this is just not worth any kind of risk. So for that already we are glad to oppose this. Yeah.
What you're assuming that's going to happen to the European economic area with this partnership. What is the current economic growth of the EU?
I have no idea, to be honest. Like, don't care about it, to be honest. Okay, let's move on. Second point, job loss in the EU. The problem is that what happens is that most of the jobs will go to the US. The US has a better labor force there, and they're predicting that if this kind of thing happen in the Europe, we might lose up to 1 million jobs here. This is a really bad thing, especially for the smaller countries in the EU, which really have problems, and also the countries that already have a high unemployment rate. We're talking about a massive loss of jobs, which hampers the development of these individual countries here, and this is already why the EU should be opposed to it, and why we don't want this thing to happen. And third of all, talking about democracy. See, the US has an interesting culture. It's a lobbying culture, and their democracy already is kind of shaky. That it's not really the people who are electing the things, but it's actually the companies lobbying what they want to happen in the world. And we see that when this happens in such a big scale, and these two economies become basically one, we're talking about the companies ruling two big continents, basically, and deciding instead of the people what should be happening, which means that democracy in itself is going to be a lot worse off after this, and we believe it's not good for the people of either of these places, that they don't actually have a say in it just because some people want some more money. For these reasons, I beg you to propose.
Madam Speaker, thank you for the floor. Well, while Tony might not care, or definitely might not know, the EU is an economic crisis. The economic growth that he talks about is not small in any way. The economic growth that he talks about is not insignificant in any way. The economic growth that he talks about is not absolutely essential for our economies in this time. Before we move on to our case, we want to go through like 5 points of rebuttal to what he said. So I think like what we hear is essentially like a lot of facts with little logic, but that's what happens when you have to figure this thing out. It's quite complex. Firstly, like Tõnis just claims this thing like it's a rigged game. It's a bunch of evil corporations going to like have to earn a lot of money. I think like we think that that doesn't stand the test of logic. Like firstly, because we decrease all kinds of barriers in trade, like big corporations already necessarily gain more competition. We don't see like why it would be so good for these corporations. They would have to prove us why it is. Secondly, they point to the fact that yes, there were some discussions with lobby groups, like completely ignoring the fact that like governments of countries have been discussing it for years, and it's probably like an established practice with establishing any trade policy to discuss with lobby groups. Like, fine. We also seen that the European Commission is now inviting all kinds of NGOs to raise their opinions on these issues, and we think that they're going to take these issues into account. Lastly, we still think that like at the end it will not be in the hands of the companies themselves. themselves, or no one will be trading them on individual member countries. This we believe will still be a place where member states of the EU will have to opt into and not just have it forced upon them. Like, thirdly, they talk about this quick money thing. Like, Tõnis just comes out and claims like banking regulations are gonna like go below the US levels in like pre-crisis. We think that that is like a horrid Armageddon scenario that like no one in the US themselves would ever lobby for, and like no one in EU would agree for. Given that both sides already have higher banking regulation standards, they would not agree to lower them, especially when we have the precedent of the global financial crisis, and we already know and agreed on the causes of that. So we think that, like, again, logically it doesn't make sense. Fourthly, he says that US will gain jobs, you know, we will lose. We think that that is something that we will have to deal with. And we think that, like, it's not bad for our economies. We think that it wasn't the case in like creating the EU, which essentially is also like few countries creating a common economic group. We saw that like even like what it did for our economies, it made our economies more efficient, because then small countries began to specialize in more important things. Like bigger countries like took up things that need economies of scale to produce. Like in the end, everyone won massively from creating this one market. And like fifthly, he talks about this being undemocratic, and again going to companies. We point to the fact that, like, obviously we're going to deal in arguments why not necessarily big companies win, but like also the fact that it's still like an opt-in thing for individual member states, so we don't believe that like these countries will be pressured in, and if they do, it's their fault. So, right, Europe is in crisis thing. Let's start our case. I think that, Madam Speaker, trade isn't what it used to be. We have seen retraction and decline in overall world trade. Globalization has been slowing down, and the benefits of trade have been slowing down, especially for the EU and the US. We think that trading is losing momentum on a global scale, and that is because protectionism and transaction costs are raising through time. We think that, like, we're talking about not only the direct costs, like not direct transaction costs, but also many indirect things that countries have. So companies, like, for instance, subsidize certain industries to raise the transaction costs of, let's say, trading agriculture between the EU and US. We on our side think that, for instance, the EU agriculture policy is a bunch of wash, and we think that it could be made much more efficient. And we think that this is one of the high subsidy transaction cost things that we have to avoid in these things. We think, like, in reality, we do need a solution. Because Europe is in crisis, what Tõnis tends to ignore, it is not a trade-off that we're facing of losing something. It's an opportunity to create the biggest trade zone that ever existed. The projected benefits of it is not only to, like, let's humanize the 2% of GDP. The 2% of GDP means, on average, 545 euros for every EU household. Secondly, 800,000 jobs created within the EU, fairly cheaper prices for everyone within the union. We think that these are great things that we can have. We think that the main point of this agreement, and like what Tõnis fails to explain, is like equalizing standards for different sectors, which means, you know, simply, it makes it easier to buy and sell stuff. Like, we can paint these things and talk about evil banks, but like in the end, it like boils down to economy and product trade between countries. Now, like, how it works is firstly like the, you know, free trade of goods, free flow of goods. It's pretty obvious. It tends to make things cheaper. It won't just destroy our industry just because they say so. Because firstly, like, US and EU already have many barriers removed, and it hasn't destroyed our industry so far. It's making our economies more efficient. Secondly, you know, like, it allows our countries to specialize in different things. Now, obviously, like EU has the things that, like, our countries like Germany can produce better cars than US can. Like, no one wants to buy Fords in the world in general, but like people want to buy Mercedes. So like the fact is that like US will start producing less of Fords, and they start to move in industries where they're better at. I don't know, making guns, or like interventions, exploring democracy. But also many serious things. So like why that is very good to people is because it firstly goes straight to vulnerable groups. So things tend to become cheaper. Food, healthcare becomes cheaper because free flow of goods. Thus, you know, like the people in EU and US who have the least money are able to afford more things. Secondly, for the general economy, it's really not a quick way to get money. It's the fact that like everyone's income like not only increases but also our goods become cheaper. So we think that like that grows our economies in a time where our economies are retracting. Like secondly, we think it helps small and medium businesses. Now notice that like now trade is failing because trade is expensive with the regulations we have. It only makes sense for big companies to trade because of the huge administration costs. If a small and medium business wants to export to the US, they have to face things like certification, like testing. They have such high costs that only a big company can face them and have economies of scale. That is the thing that empowers big business and multinationals that they really hate, Madam Speaker. And we think that that is the thing that we should worry about. So at the end of the day, what we think is that the EU will start losing things either way. The nice things that we have, high labor standards, ecology, sustainable energy, we will lose them because our economies are retracting. Therefore, we have an opportunity to enter a new free trade agreement, make things cheaper, create new jobs, make our economies more efficient. We think it also does massive things for global power and all these nice things in the world. So we think, yeah.
Right. The trade agreement currently being negotiated, it's not a simple issue. What I'm going to do is simplify the case and show you, in essence, what the problem here is. So basically, what the trade agreement assumes is that the European Union and the US are basically sort of the same. There are some limits to trade. Why not all tie our knots and why not play together? What I'm going to show you that there's a fundamental difference to how European Union states and the United States see, for example, to what extent should a government protect its own citizens for corporate interests? I'm going to base most of my extension on the standards that we're losing out on, that the governments have, of these countries have established to protect their own. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the current investment disputes mechanism and how that will very much be detrimental to the European Union sovereignty. Before that, some points of rebuttal. Firstly, we hear the main benefit brought is leavening economy by that side, right? They say you get a GDP growth, one number a year. The thing here is that benefit is not sustainable because tariffs are already quite low, currently around 3%, meaning you can't lower them. There's not much room to lower them, meaning all of the benefits have a ticking clock to them. Secondly, you heard the statement that you need to live and trade, and for that you need to tie these two. You need to live and trade because there's crisis, right? So this means we should tie our knots. The problem here is that tying knots will be crucial if the crisis is something that we cannot simply buy ourselves out of. Basically, the European Union is a one-ton ship attaching itself to a 10-ton anchor. If the second one goes down, there is nothing for the European Union to do, right? So if once you start, furthermore, any sort of solutions to further crisis will be led by the United States and followed by the European Union. The smaller almost always has to compromise. Take the Greek bailout. We can debate all we want about whether it was useful for the whole system. I think we can all agree that the average Greek lost out from the Greek bailout because the IMF led the process. In this analogy, the whole European Union is that small average Greek losing out. Then you hear, we told you that the negotiated treaty is not in the interest of two states, but the massive corporations. 92% of these negotiations is between US corporations and European Union states. We firstly get the response, well, they're including NGOs as well. We think that that's very similar to how Monsanto asks the opinion of some NGOs before it goes ahead and burns a forest. simply lip service. Secondly, we heard that governments themselves agree, EU governments themselves currently agree. Let's make the distinction. EU politicians currently agree. The reason for that is that they will probably get the short-term benefits of GDP growth, meaning a lot of free money to shower your citizens with to get electoral votes. What they're paying for, what they're using to pay it for, is promises to lower standards, standards that we all need and believe are crucial in the European system. Going to my first argument, before that second.
So, could you please elaborate a little bit, what kind of standards are we going to be losing with this?
Thank you. My argument, talking about standards that we are going to losing about this, begins now. Okay, as I said, the underlying assumption behind this treaty is that we are the same, the barriers and standards we currently have are merely an inconvenience, something that different bureaucrats wrote in different words. We should all start, let's take them down. More effectiveness, more GDP. Let's now talk about what standards we're discussing, directly against you. One, healthcare standards, right? What quality of care does a hospital owe to its customers? Secondly, what can a customer do after medical malpractice? Thirdly, how much do medical care cost? Something that is very much controlled by the US corporate healthcare system, in which the case all of these questions favor the corporations and hospitals at the expense of the customer, that is the ill person about to die, right? Secondly, consumer safety. How much chemicals are you allowed to put in your food? What are the limits to advertising, including to children? Finally, environmental protection standards, pollution quotas, all of that stuff. The problem here, so these are things that have explicitly been created with the interest of the European Union citizen in mind, to protect the weaker party. What's the problem here is? The problem here is that we have a fundamental difference between the European Union and the US to how many standards you should be. The US corporate culture very much promotes those that have succeeded, the corporations. They say social state as a thing is a sham. They say pull yourself up by the bootstraps. They say governments do not need to protect people. These are some of the principles that we fundamentally disagree with. We say, let's make less profits, but let's protect the weakest party. Let's protect the person going to the hospital. Let's protect the people, the children being advertised to. Let's protect the people eating the food. We say those things are important, and if we lose out on the GDP or any sort of corporate benefits, we'll take it. The US won't. We say if these standards lose out, our way of how we understand the state's role loses out. No, thank you. Finally, let's talk about the investment dispute settlement mechanism. Again, like a clear introduction to what that is. So basically, we have negotiated the treaty. Now, the corporations acting under that treaty, if they feel that their rights have not been, their entitlements have not been upheld, they can go and sue that country in a dispute mechanism settlement, which is arbitrated by like 3 to 5 to 10 people, like a small number of people. Two problems with that. One, that treaty is in no way will be negotiated in the interest of EU, because two parties, basically European Union countries, corporations, discussing what should be the limits on the actions of corporations. Those corporations know so much more about their limits or how they can be evaded than the EU countries, right? They have had a test field on the US field. They know how to evade limits. That is why you get products called, I can't believe it's not butter, and people believing it's butter, right? Things like that, small things, how you can evade negotiated treaty provisions, even if you spend a lot of time for that. Finally, if their rights are not entitled, they can go to that court and say, we either are demanding billions in lost profits or we're demanding for you to change your laws. This is a massive detriment economically, a massive detriment in sovereign terms. We don't want any of those things. We like those standards and we like our sovereignty. For these reasons, very proud to be on that side.
points in my speech. First of all, I want to talk about corporation control over the negotiations. Secondly, this idea about suing states and why that's not actually as bad as they try to paint it. Thirdly, about the importance of EU and United States being powerful international actors and being economically sustainable. And fourthly, about the idea of protecting citizens and how we actually achieve that the best way and why it happens on our side of the house. Before that, like most of my rebuttal is going to be integrated. Before that, 3 outstanding points. First of all, they say it's not sustainable. It's not going to be sustainable economic growth. First of all, we'll tell you when we remove those barriers, trade becomes bigger forever. Like, it's not something that just goes away once it balances out. That's just ridiculous. But even if barriers are already low, like, it's still a benefit and it's still better than the status quo anyway, and the kind of economic effects that Gediminas talks about still hold, like, perfectly fine. We also think that there's indirect costs associated with the differences between legislation that Gediminas already talked to you about that also are lessened and that are now costing a lot to both companies and people. No, thank you. Second of all, they say there's a disbalance of power between the EU and the United States. That's just blatantly not true. Like, the EU economy is as big as the United States, has 3 times more people. Like, we think that if there's no specific disbalance between those two, that occurs just because, like, United States very powerful. Like, we're powerful too. Perfectly fine. Thirdly, they say politicians will want to shower people in money and all that stuff. First of all, we think that they have an interest also to be re-elected in the long term, as long as possible stay in power, right? So, you know, why would they create a huge bubble and then crash it? For what reason and what purpose would they ever want to do that? Presumably, they want something that will long-term work and create them a good reputation among their voters for a long time. But secondly, we just do think it's sustainable. We think this whole, like, analysis of a huge bubble then crash is pretty much ridiculous. Okay, so multinationals and all that stuff, and why we think that what they say with regard to that is completely wrong. So the first proposition characterization of this is, you know, some rich bastards came into one room, decided this thing, and told no one. Okay, the fact is that rich also benefit from, like the fact that rich benefit, first of all, is not bad in itself necessarily. Well, unless you're communist, but in this debate, let's assume we're not. But secondly, we think that the rich corporates also, like the politicians, have an interest in long-term growth. Like, any big corporation actually cares about the fact that it can, like, be powerful in the long term. It's not about, oh, I'll get money for 1 year and then nothing. Like, they do care about the fact that they will get money for the rest of the time, obviously. Second of all, this idea about suing governments and why it's completely not the case what they say. Okay, so why will this not happen the way that they say, like, companies will sue governments and control everything, right? You can only sue states for 2 things under the proposed plan. One of them is that if there's discrimination based on the nationality, like the nation that you're actually selling to. So if you sell to one nation cheaper than another, that's something you can get sued for. Secondly, it's expropriation. I am very ESL today. Okay. We don't think that this is such a nightmare. If you take into consideration the fact that the EU, as well as the World Trade Organization, already have mechanisms that are quite similar to this to some extent, like with regard to punishing some people for doing the same thing, like didn't cause the earth to, like, explode. It's perfectly also fine. The whole idea of absolute corporation control is just a blatant lie with that regard. I will actually take that BOI. Yeah.
Is so amazing, then why EU has any outside trade regulations at all?
Like, because not every single country is the United States. Not every single country has the same kind of legislation, the same kind of, like, the same kind of quality of products, whatever. Like, if you open up trade with just any random shitty country, like that's not going to bring you the same type of benefits, but rather the kind of unemployment they talk about, like the difference between those 2 states is going to be bigger and be a massive problem in that situation when it's not with the case of the United States in comparison. So, like, no, there are reasons. Okay, so importance of EU and United States power. So, we think that the rise of China and the decline of the United States and the EU overall is a globally massive problem. And we think that at the point where we can unite these 2 powers and make sure that they, once for one thing, actually have an incentive to cooperate in the long run, but also when they do become economically more powerful together, that is massively good. Why? Because they get like more political power overall, especially with regard to international negotiations of all kinds, with regards to solving international relations issues, etc. We think that like that is the best way they can protect actually their citizens' interests and like their own interests within that international sphere. Because like, as Gediminas already told you, this will be literally the biggest economic zone in the world and the most powerful one at that point. That gives us massive leverage in comparison to what we previously would have had in terms of actually controlling things and like being able to convince other actors to do what we want. Okay, lastly, this idea about protecting citizens. So Lauri talks about hospitals, first of all, which is completely like irrelevant to this debate for one single reason. At this moment, and we assume we have to defend this variant of this like deal, right? Privatizations of hospitals, education, and other stuff like that is simply not included in it yet, or hopefully will not be. But I mean, we assume we have to defend the current way it happens. Okay, but secondly, they talk about also consumer safety, right? We tell you there's a trade-off here, right? At the, like many of the things that they talk about, like environmental standards, for example, actually make stuff cheaper, and also just the general policy makes stuff cheaper. We think that if you want to protect the consumers who are currently like disenfranchised and poor in Europe and don't have enough money to feed themselves, will be more better off at the point where they can actually afford stuff. Like in comparison to, you know, it's a bit environmental and there's some GMOs, whatever, no, like Vinog. All the nice stuff we have at this moment, we will not have at the point where our economic situation will decline, as Gediminas also talked to you about. We think that a meaningful way of protecting the actual poor and like the people who are disenfranchised is making sure that they can afford stuff. That's one of the best and biggest impacts of this policy is the fact that you get more competition and therefore stuff becomes cheaper, but you also get that effect of not having all those regulations, whatever, even if that happens, like, and then still stuff is even more cheaper because you don't have to take so much care about the environment. For all those reasons, very proud to stand in opposition. Thank you.
Okay, hi guys. The second government will not give you today the most glamorous case. We will not offer you the most fun-sounding arguments, but we are going to show you in real economic politics and real economic effects how this policy is really bad, and rather why we would like to have sugar a bit more expensive rather than people having no job and no money to buy the sugar at all in the beginning. And I will do 4 rebuttals and then 2 of my own arguments. Well, firstly, we heard that more freedom equals bigger economy. Well, yes, but the bigger economy means that large companies benefit from the bigger economy, not the actual people who work in that economy. Large international companies can now have more profits. They can import, export stuff more freely. They have less regulation. But what that really means is that the actual people who work in those countries lose their jobs because now the international companies can take over, for example, the agricultural system, which is basically my own first argument. Secondly, why this is a really bad agreement? Why, for example, why would they asked us? Why would politicians want to instate the bad political agreement? Well, and then they would not get re-elected. Well, yeah, politicians want to get re-elected, but what politicians want more than re-election is money to get into the re-election. For example, in the US, you need millions and millions of dollars to get back into the Senate. You need a really big campaign, and that money only comes from the lobby, from the economic lobby that gives you that money. And if you don't have the support of the big international companies lobby, you will never have the money to get back into office, and that's why they support the lobby and the international companies' agendas. Thirdly, thirdly, we heard that the agreement does not mean that the countries in that agreement are best friends forever. For example, we have Mexico and the US in NAFTA. They are not they are not one cohesive unit. The US and Mexico do not do every economic policy like one big machine. They have their own ideas, they have their own agendas. They are both together in NAFTA, but they do not want the same objectives in every single situation. And that's why the US and the European Union will never be one cohesive unit in defense of their some kind of policies. Okay, to my own arguments. But before that, and in my own arguments, I will show you why the US and the EU are so different, and why we cannot have the trade agreement with the US, like we can't have the trade agreement with some poor countries that they didn't want to have the trade agreements with. That's okay. But before that, go Gediminas.
Yeah, you cannot just come out and lie to all these nice people here that only big companies gain. We tell you how lowering regulations means that small, medium businesses from the EU and US are able to now export and import goods.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Small and medium company business export might be cool, but moving on to my first argument, I will show you how practically the EU will fail as a whole if this this agreement goes through. Well, we know that the EU's main objective is to protect its strategically weak industries. The weakest industry in the European Union is the agricultural industry. 60% of the EU budget goes into the agricultural sector. The EU practically subsidizes agriculture and does nothing else. 40% of the EU is something else, but 60%, the main reason of the EU is the agriculture budget. This shows us that the EU is the weakest and most vulnerable in this in the agricultural sense. If we allow cheap US corn and sugar and stuff like that into the European economy, this will mean that the EU has two choices. The EU can either subsidize agriculture even more. Maybe 100% of the EU's budget might go into agriculture, then the EU would be like the European Agricultural Union, not the European Union anymore. Or we could let our agricultural ship sink, say to hell with food and corn and sugar and potatoes. We can get all the GMO stuff from the US, and food security does not concern us because, no guys, we do not have any danger of like famine or like Russia attacking us, where we might need our own food in our own cellars and stuff like that. Okay, so this also applies to other businesses in Europe who comply with the European standards. We know that the European standards are quite high. Like if you want to produce something in the European Union, you have to put a lot of money into the health requirements and stuff like that. The US is not that strong and adamant on those questions. The US standards are much more lower. So this means that practically the EU products are too good for the US market. If we want to export something to the US, then the US consumer will always see that our product is much more expensive, and then they will prefer the cheaper one. And this means that the EU will never be able to export its small and medium businesses because those low and medium businesses will always have to comply with the EU regulations, for example, in the health department, that the US doesn't have. To my second argument. Why we need to protect our own people? Well, take the US and the EU governments. They have been elected into the office with the help of their own people. The main objective of them is to help their own people. currently, what the first half showed us is that this agreement is based upon the money and the input of big international companies who want this thing, not the people who voted those politicians into office, and those big corporations want maximum profit. But what the state should actually want is to get not the biggest maximum economy. The state should want the biggest maximum welfare for its citizens, and if we do not have any agriculture, if we cannot export anything to the U.S., and if we face these dangers, we believe that you should vote for the second government. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The European Union is currently on strife, right? We are in a crisis. We are on a crisis of identity. We don't know what our role is in the society or in the global scenario which we're in, and we are often under economic pressure, right? We know what we see at the same time is that China is rising as much as they can, growing double digits every year. We have Africa as the biggest promise for the next decade in economics, and we have also smaller Asian and Middle Eastern states trying to exercise their influence over absolutely everywhere in the world. What we know is that the EU today alone cannot guarantee the situation of the Western liberal economies and Western liberal democracies in the world in the future, in the long run. We need help. The US is the best partner for us to look for help. I'm going to explain to you why we believe that this is the only way for Western liberal economies to actually strive in the future is through a very long-lasting partnership with the US and how the EU has to do that. And I'm going to continue explaining why the EU needs to reform its economy today in order to remain competitive and remain a major player in the world economic scenario, right? So these are my two main points. First of all, some very clear points of rebuttal. The government did not really understand what are the types of sanctions and what are the types of regulatory situations going on. So this trade deal will not completely destroy all sorts of trade, all sorts of regulations in the EU in order to match the US. That's not what the proposal is about at all. It's to find a common ground and find a common benefit that it's good for everyone and it's actually beneficial for both sides, right? The US has stricter regulations in many areas and the EU has stricter regulations in many areas, and we'll have to find a common ground for both sides. It's beneficial for both sides in terms of regulations, right? I can go into that in detail if you guys want, but I'm going to try to put myself into what is exactly that we believe to be not speculation in terms of who is going to get more sanctions or not. The audience, please, thank you. So yeah, going on to exactly my main point, right? So we know that currently what's going on is that you have, in one side you have Russia with trying to exercise their power, creating the Eurasian European Union. You have Eurasian Union, whatever they're called. You have China growing a lot and trying to exercise their power as much as they can, and you have a lot of our sides, Western liberal democracies, trying to survive, right? So we have jobs fleeing to China every day, and we have very, very complicated situation, specifically in Europe, right, as we know it today, right? So we know that when you create stronger ties, right, when you're able to actually put together economic treaties the way Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands did in the 90s, you're actually increasing communication, and that increasing communication between different parties also increases integration, understanding, and connects these two parties in many different ways, right? So we believe that Western liberal democracies, as they are today, they need to integrate and they need to talk more in order to gain the economy of scale and gain influence on the international scenario. Right? We think that making a partnership, economic partnership with the US is the best way for the EU to increase this connection with another very, very big Western liberal democracy, which actually brings benefits in the global scenario. And this integration is going to actually allow us to affect influence over many different countries, right? So how are we going to do that? I'm going to explain in a bit, but yes, closing.
If the EU isn't a coercive unit currently against Russia, why would we be a coercive unit against Russia with the TTIP agreement?
Well, because simply once you have the US backing us up, not only like in terms of military power, as they do often in NATO, but also in other cultural aspects of our daily life, which we believe to be the case once we have these trade agreements set in a very, very long run, we believe that that's going to be much stronger for us to actually sustain ourselves in our political positions and our ideals, right? So that's very important. So what we know is that this type of connection between the US and the EU is going to create a standard, right? So a standard of trade. And this standard of trade is extremely important for us to exert influence. And this influence, because we will be wanted to be traded with, will exactly extrapolate our borders and go into Africa and go into South America and go into other rising economies which we need to exert political influence on. And the best way to do that is through exactly these economic laws and economic rules that we want to pass and we want to enforce, right? So we want the South Americans and we want the Africans to trade under our regulations and under our rules. So finding this common regulation in a global scenario exactly puts pressure into other countries to operate under our standards and of course gives us a lot of bargaining power in every single sense. So this works together for the economic side, but also most importantly for the political side when the US and the EU gain a lot of importance in the global scenario, and that's really important given the challenge which we're currently being faced with, right? And it's very, very important for the survival of Western liberal democracies in general. So why does the EU, why this would force Europe to actually reform, right? So currently our economies are not as competitive as we know it. So we're losing a lot of jobs to the world, and the government is proposing that we simply close our eyes to that, and perhaps even end the EU and just stay within our countries, so that we can here work on whatever we are working with here, and pretend that we are not in a global scenario where the economies are completely intertwined, right? So this is not a sustainable way to react to this type of problem, because the jobs will continue to flow to the place where it's cheaper to actually produce. By actually creating this type of union, we're going to actually have to reform our labor laws and reform the way we operate exactly so that our jobs are more competitive and we're actually able to get some of the share of the lion that's going towards especially Asia, right? So this would force the EU to reform on what's less competitive on, be it in specific, as I said, so in labor laws, or be it also in food regulations, on some other regulations which we are not competitive in a global scenario, right? So this would actually increase a lot of importance in this sense. So this alignment, so just to conclude, this alignment between Europe and the US, it's exactly a major challenge right now, and we have the rise in Africa, which is an area which we need to impose our influence on, and we have also the fact that if we do not unite today with this economic measure, which is the first one to actually towards get a political union on the very end very strong, we can actually see the end of Western liberal democracies as we know it, with the rise of China, which is a dictatorship, and the rise of Russia, which is also a dictatorship, more and more aggressive as we know it. So because of these reasons, I beg you to oppose this motion and do create a trade agreement between Europe and the US. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, time, yes. Okay, we, the government bench, the communist Estonians, say that free trade isn't always that good, right? I'm going to summarize this debate in 3 points. I'm going to talk about Western Bloc as a whole and how we Western liberal democracies can be as powerful as possible. Then I'm going to talk about the people, what will benefit the people, will it benefit the people or will it harm the people, and then financial health of the EU and what will happen. Before that, some points of rebuttal to the half-ass extension of the closing opposition, right? He told us that jobs are flowing out. Jobs are flowing out. Nobody wants to produce anything in the EU. Everything is bad, right? And in order to change that, we need to hold hands with the United States of America, and then everything will be perfect because we are forced to reform. The question is, why can't we reform without the USA? We can also reform things. We can also reform our labor laws without the USA. We can do these things. They haven't told us why we need the USA for that. Secondly, that now we're going to be a massive global power because USA is backing us not only in a military sense but also with money. We say we as a it's like the first summary point. Western Bloc as a whole. We already kind of suck as a union because we Estonians really want to take sanctions against Russia, and the Finnish guys said that that we don't need it at the moment. We say in the EU today we are not the cohesive unit. We can't take EU stance that on this issue we have one big EU stance. It's even harder when you have United States in the mix because if you have one extra massive party that has to agree with our policy that is okay with every European country, we were less likely to get that one stance against any big issue. Now, secondly, what will benefit the people? We say 2 points. Firstly, social services. We say already we have massively different standards about social services in the EU and in the United States. Because US calls Swedes communists, right? They're communist state that are really hardcore socialist, right? We call Swedish people just nice because they care about their people. We say the definition of what is the role of our state is different in Europe and the United States. Therefore, we can't have a same standard because just people aren't used to these standards that are in the US. For example, in Europe, and people in the USA think that our standards are quite stupid as well. Closing.
So answering your question on why we need that kind of trade right now to get the reforms done. Basically, it's because we haven't done it so far in the 30 years, and now the country is in crisis, so that's why we need it so far, right? That's otherwise we would have done it no. And second, to answer your question,
you only get one BOI. Now the thing is that. Yes, we are in crisis. We are in crisis. USA was also kind of in crisis, right? The thing is, if we are when we are even a bigger unit as a whole, if we ever get into the crisis again, the crisis will be even worse because as under the opposition world, we are going to be really cohesive unit, or economic systems will be really close knit together, right? And if one party fails, everybody fails, just as it works in the European Union. If now we have also United States in the mix, we're going to fail even harder, and we don't kind of want to fail harder, right? Secondly, will it benefit the people? Now, I told about social services, now work and prices and so on. The reason why we have trade regulations and such today in Europe is that we need to protect something. We need to protect ourselves from the outside, right? And USA has really different trade regulations. They have the corporate lobby is much more stronger in USA. They don't have such strict regulations, right? The thing is that if Estonian corporations says that it's really bad to produce something in Estonia because Estonian state says you have to get really high regulations. You must pay lots of money as we do in Estonia, right? Then he's going to send his work to USA. He's going to send his work to USA, and European Union and Estonia has failed its role as a state to protect its own citizens. And why we have trade agreements, why we have trade regulations, is to protect our own people from the outside forces, and we have failed to do that. Gediminas.
Yeah, the comparative to this debate is not whether we keep the same standards in the EU or not, because it's unsustainable. If you want to keep subsidizing your agriculture, you have to tell us how else can the EU come out of the crisis and become competitive again.
we say we don't have to prove you how are we going to get even more competitive. We say we just have to prove you that this plan isn't going to make me more competitive. This plan is going to make me, if we are going to fail, we're going to fail even harder. It's the opposition side, that has to prove us why this is the only and the most efficient way to get Europe going again. Now, financial health of EU. We say, yes, they're going to get the 2% GDP raise. Why not? We could do it by, like, I don't know, adding Turkey to the EU. Then we're going to, like, also getting 2% GDP raise. Like we say, like 2% GDP raise isn't that big of a deal for us, right? The EU is protecting us from the outside forces, right? Such as in things such as agriculture. The reason why we can still do agriculture and have our own food and our own food security in Europe is because EU always subsidizes it. It's the 60% thing. If we're going to lose that, then if we're going to say, you know, getting corn from Iowa because it's really cheap in Iowa is okay for us, Europe. We lose out on our own values that we need to protect ourselves from outside forces. And if we don't have our own food, like what else do we have? We don't have anything else in Europe, right? We're going to lose whole agricultural sector as whole. We say it's massively harmful for its people because, you know, people, even if they're going to get like cheaper sugar, they're not going to have they don't have job. They're not going to get any wages to buy that sugar, so it's like bad on both sides, right? Secondly, if we don't have our own food and our own like food security, it's even worse against Russia. It's even worse against these outside forces where we buy our food today. And for all these reasons, and because we're from Estonia, please vote for government.
So now it works. All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, Madam Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen. What we've had today has been a debate about whether or not we should increase standardization and free trade between two economic blocs like the United States of America and the European Union. The debate has clashed around the government's focus on assertions, wanting to measure predictions versus predictions, whilst not really being sure about their numbers. Secondly, questioning the legitimacy of the process due to the government's paranoia over corporate control, as well as the third clash, that is the government's belief that cowboys will come with their talk of communism and bootstraps and merely decide everything, because apparently the EU doesn't get any say in any matters, which is ridiculous, we think, on the opposition side. And fourthly, we believe that we on the opposition have shown that this will actually help both EU and US foreign policy, as well as setting a standard for global trade and therefore having a positive impact globally. But first, some very quick rebuttal. The government has asked, why do we need the USA? I mean, we can, just change work laws or kind of make things efficient. Sure, that's true, but if we can make things more efficient and get this really good trade deal and increase our economies, why don't we do both? So that's not really a relevant thing to say why we couldn't do this now. Then they say that we should, that we're going to fail harder, that the US economic crash, because we'll be more linked. You know what, 2008 showed us that we're already so economically linked around the world that these economic crashes happen anyway. We'd rather we have regulatory standards so that the world is a more predictable place and therefore we'll have less crises.
Sure, I'll take opening. Okay. TTIP is only orientated for economic growth, conceding different standards, endangering economics and democracy, essentially taking risks and gambling, hoping for a positive result. This is too big of a risk, especially as we have the opportunities to have specific trade agreements when necessary without conceding these standards.
So lots of talk about risk. Apparently, this is all a big gamble. No, this is clearly an attempt to create clear standard regulations. For example, Europe has much stricter banking laws than the United States. That's why the financial crisis didn't come from over here. And we believe that the US can benefit from, for example, getting more financial banking laws. And in fact, they've been making their own banking laws stricter as well. Okay, so firstly, about assertions. So the government has been focusing throughout this debate a lot on assertions. They say millions of jobs will be lost from the EU. 1 to 2% is the only sort of GDP benefit that we will get from this. But they don't really know if 1 to 2% is that significant, is that not, you know, they don't know what the EU's sort of growth numbers are. And also these kind of predictions, you know, we also have projections, as we've mentioned on the opposition side, that, you know, this will actually increase global trade for the long term. You know, this is a there's, you know, thousands, like $1 trillion in trade moving between the two countries. You know, these are all just like predictions. But sort of, we believe that it has significant impact. But then we have the second clash, which is over the legitimacy of the project, of the process. So they've said that they believe that this is all controlled by corporations, that there hasn't been an open enough process. But the thing is that trade deals, like we've said, are negotiated this way. That, you know, you can't have the media constantly second-guessing everything. You need to be able to negotiate when you have two different political entities so that you can come up with a question. And even if we might argue that maybe the final version should be put to a vote, say in the European Parliament, that doesn't change the fact that we hope that that process passes, and we think that that would be a good thing. They've also talked about how this investor-state dispute settlements will be bad, but they already exist, as we've said, within the EU, for example, and whilst they're working for transparency, we think that they really can be sort of a good thing. So then I'll move on to the third clash, which is that they believe that this is all about sort of America getting to set all the standards and that Europe will not have sort of any. But we believe that whilst Europe has, yes, higher regulations currently, we believe that lowering those regulations is, first of all, not necessarily a bad thing, because things like, for example, our agriculture regulations are problematic and wasteful. So we believe that that would actually be a good thing if we lower them. We also believe that because as we've mentioned, that because the EU has more people in the United States, and because we have, they are close to equal trade partners with sort of 500 billion in exports from Europe to the United States and 450 billion in exports from the United States to Europe, that they are equal partners at the table. They've also said that, you know, healthcare will be privatized into an American model. Now that's ridiculous because, as we've said, schools and healthcare are currently not included, and it's also unclear why the sort of more expensive American system will suddenly be more efficient and therefore win out against the European healthcare systems that are currently cheaper. So that doesn't, we believe that on that clash we've also been clear. I will take closing.
So is it more or less likely that if cheap US food floods the market, our agriculture will suffer and the EU will have to redefine itself as the European Agricultural Union?
It's not likely at all. First of all, the United States subsidizes its food as well. They themselves spend billions on corn subsidies to keep it cheap within their own country. So if they're going to make their corn cheap, then they're going to be spending more money as well. So that just doesn't make any sense. But to move on to my fourth point, which is why we believe this will have a global impact and increase standardization. So we believe that it increases the cooperation between the two blocks with the highest concentration of Western liberal democracies, which is the European Union and the United States. We believe that because they control, they currently control 1/3 of global trade. We believe that when you create standards, this will be an example for the rest of the world to follow, because other countries will also want to trade. When other agreements are drawn up, they will follow this model, and that allows us to create higher standards for example, the African bloc, for South American companies, even for China in the future. And we believe that by setting this example, the EU and the United States can help on a global level. So for all these reasons, we believe that on these clashes, the government has clearly just focused on assertions over numbers that they can't really follow the logic through on, because we believe that the legitimacy of the process is correct that this shouldn't be just corporate paranoia, because we believe that the American way will not necessarily triumph in this case. We believe that these are negotiations between equal partners, and because we believe that this can have a global impact in standardizing, we beg you to oppose this motion. Thank you.